Welcome to cardiac physiology. In the cardiac anatomy, we talked about the pieces and parts, and now we're going to talk about those pieces and parts and how they work. There are two phases to the cardiac cycle. The first phase is diastole, and this is the relaxation phase of this process. The blood enters through the tricuspid and the mitral valves, meaning it goes from the atriums to the ventricles. And preload is really important. Preload is really important to move that blood from the atrium to the ventricles, so the ventricles get filled with a lot of blood so they can squeeze it to the lungs and then squeeze it to the body. Then systole is the second phase. You'll have the contraction of the atriums, pushing that extra little bit of blood into those ventricles to fill them up and stretch them as far as they can be stretched. And then you have the contraction of the ventricles in this phase. One thing you may hear in your ICU rotations is ejection fraction. A normal ejection fraction is 2/3 the volume of your ventricles. So keep that in mind, 2/3 the volume of your ventricles. All right, following on with that ejection fraction, let's talk about stroke volume. Remember, ejection fraction is 2/3 the volume of those ventricles, and a normal stroke volume is about 70 milliliters or 70 cc's, and that's what is squeezed out during that systole cycle. Stroke volume depends on preload. Remember, we've got to have preload to have cardiac output, and we've got to have cardiac output to have that blood pressure. So stroke volume depends on preload, cardiac contractility, how well that heart is squeezing, and then afterload. And afterload is how much those vessels are squeezing down that vasoconstriction, because that's the force your heart has to push against to pump blood through those pipes. Stirling's law. This should be a review from your hemorrhage and shock class. Stirling's law states that the more a muscle is stretched, the greater the force of contraction. Sort of like the rubber bands in this picture. The more you stretch that rubber band, the further it flies across the room to hit your friend. So Stirling's law, we got to stretch that muscle, meaning fill it up really full so that heart squeezes forcefully. Then cardiac output is the volume of blood that the heart pumps in 1 minute. And that is stroke volume times your heart rate equals that cardiac output. Remember that an average stroke volume is 70. So go ahead and take your pulse right now and figure out your pulse minute rate, times that by 70, and that's your cardiac output for 1 minute. Another equation that exams like is blood pressure, and blood pressure equals stroke volume times heart rate times that peripheral vascular resistance. So know the three parts of that blood pressure equation and cardiac output. All right, the autonomic nervous system controls our heart. So there's two parts to that autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is that body's gas pedal. You step on the gas and you get ready to fight or run. So this arises from the thoracic and lumbar regions of your spinal cord, and that makes up that cardiac plexus. This cardiac plexus innervates the atriums and ventricles. Remember the big neurotransmitters in the sympathetic nervous system. Neurotransmitters for the sympathetic nervous system are norepinephrine and epinephrine. I'll say that again. The neurotransmitters for the sympathetic nervous system are norepinephrine and epinephrine. They increase that heart rate, that force of contractions, and work on vasoconstriction of your arterioles. The receptors in this sympathetic nervous system are alphas and betas. Alphas and betas. So alphas are mainly control vasoconstriction. And then beta 1 and beta 2, let's keep those simple. You have one heart, so beta 1 controls your heart, and beta 2, two lungs, controls your lungs. So with the beta 1s, you have that increased heart rate, contractility, electrical impulse conduction. Beta 2 is mainly bronchodilation, so you can suck in more oxygen to send to those muscles. The alpha receptors are primarily stimulated by norepinephrine. They increase vasoconstriction in the intestinal tract and in the skin. That peripheral vascular resistance is increased preload and stroke volume and cardiac output. This will cause your skin to be pale, cool, and clammy. So there's an alpha 1 and an alpha 2. Alpha 1 takes care of that vasoconstriction, increases preload and peripheral vascular resistance. And alpha 2 basically is the big brother, and it slaps alpha 1 and says, quit that. So that alpha 2 regulates the release of norepi that causes the alpha 1 results. If you look at our little alpha sign here, just imagine pulling on this alpha string, and it makes the circle a little smaller or vasoconstricts. We pull on the tails and it gets smaller or vasoconstricts. Those drawings weren't the best, but hey, there's only so much you can do with this crazy mouse. Vasoconstriction, alpha, alpha, alpha vasoconstriction. The beta receptors are primarily stimulated by epinephrine, that bronchodilation and cardiac function. Beta 1, one heart. Positive, inotropic. I know, squeeze my heart, yeah, I know, squeeze my heart. I know, squeeze my heart, yeah, I know, squeeze my heart. Contractility, inotropic properties, contractility. Positive, chronotropic. You use a stopwatch or a chronograph to time things. You use that watch to time your heart rate. So chronotropic deals with heart rate. And then positive dromotropic is electrical activity or electrical stimulus, impulse conductivity in the heart. So it's all beta 1s dealing with the heart. Inotropic, chronotropic, dromotropic. So then there's beta 2 with your two lungs, and that's bronchodilation and smooth muscle dilation in the bowels. The memory jogger cardio will help you remember the beta receptor properties. C, contractility, automaticity, rate, dilation. When I go faster, squeeze harder, and things are moving along, I work harder and I get irritable, and I require more oxygen when I'm working harder. So that's your beta properties: contractility, automaticity, rate, bronchial dilation. You get irritable when you work harder and you require more oxygen demand. Remember the inotropic, dromotropic, and chronotropic properties. Big ones right there. All right, so here's a little check on learning for you. What does a beta blocker medication do? Well, it blocks those beta properties. Blocking that bronchodilation and blocking that cardiac function. Ooh, was that a good thing or a bad thing? So what are those cardiac functions? C, contractility or inotropic. I know, squeeze my heart. Yeah, I know, squeeze my heart. A is automaticity or dromotropic and electrical conductivity. R is rate or chronotropic, with that chronograph. D is bronchial dilation to suck in more oxygen. Get that oxygen bolus going. And then when we're working hard, we get irritable and we require more oxygen. So remember that keyword cardio for your beta properties. The other portion of the autonomic nervous system is your brake pedal or the parasympathetic nervous system, the feed and the breed. Remember, your parasympathetic nervous system is hooked to that 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. It mainly affects the atriums and some of the upper ventricles. The neurotransmitter for your parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine, and that's used to slow your heart rate and conduction at the AV node, atrioventricular node. So remember the three properties. Hey, I talked about them a lot already, but you're seeing them again. Remember that chronotropic is heart rate, the inotropic is the squeeze, and the dromotropic is the rate of impulse conduction, So parasympathetic autonomic nervous system slows things down at that AV node. And we'll talk more about that when we do heart blocks later in this semester. Your heart is a wonderful thing, and it also works as an endocrine organ. Hormones are secreted in response to stress, mainly that stress of when your heart is super full and super stretched. So the effects of these hormones are diuresis. They want to get rid of some fluid. They get rid of that fluid by releasing sodium, and where sodium goes, water follows. And then they also vasodilate those arterioles to help lower that pressure. So you pee out sodium and vasodilation because of the hormones released by your heart due to that stress. There's an AMP, which is atrial natriuretic peptides, and there's a BNP, which is brain natriuretic peptides, but the BNP is mainly in your ventricles. Atrial natriuretic peptides are released by those atrial muscles in response to distension and sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Remember, when your heart blows up like a balloon, these hormones are released. When your heart blows up like a balloon, your hormones are released. Your ANP counteracts that renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, and we'll review that here shortly. Your BNP is secreted when your ventricles blow up like a balloon. When your ventricles blow up like a balloon, your BNP is released. That says, hey, decrease central venous pressure, cardiac output, and blood pressure. BNP levels get really high in congestive heart failure. Your heart's failing so it can't squeeze fluid out, so fluid gets backed up and stretches the heart. So BNP levels, hormone levels, go up in congestive heart failure. All right, check on learning time. write down everything you know about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We learned about this in the hemorrhage and shock class, so you should know a little bit. Go ahead and take a few minutes and write it down. All right, let's flash back to hemorrhage and shock class. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system aids in maintaining blood pressure. So that renin is released from the kidneys because it's stimulated from angiotensinogen that comes from the liver, sent to the kidneys, and that renin is released from the glomeralis. Then it converts to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 travels up to those lungs and meets up with the ACE, so the angiotensin converting enzyme, and converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, or junior, because it hooked up with the ACE and made a baby. So this process takes about 20 minutes, but the vasoconstrictor properties after this occurs increases your blood pressure. However, it does not last forever. So only about 1 hour. The angiotensin only lasts for about 1 hour. However, it also causes a release from the antidiuretic hormone saying, hey, quit peeing out sodium, and it retains sodium and water. So remember the angiotensin, renin-angiotensin system. And hey, here's a graphic representation of what I just talked about. In hypovolemic states, angiotensinogen comes from the liver, goes to the kidneys, and renin is released. And it produces angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 moves to the lungs and hooks up with that ACE. And they produce angiotensin 2. And it retains sodium and water and makes you thirsty. That's why those shock people get thirsty. And this process increases blood pressure. All right, check on learning time once again. What does ANP and BNP do for the body? Think for a moment. You know it, we just reviewed it, and you most likely have your book in front of you. Nice, nice. It vasodilates your vessels and promotes diuresis, pees out sodium, and where sodium goes, water follows. All right, next, what does renin-angiotensin system do? Hey, the opposite of ANP and BNP. Promotes vasoconstriction and retains fluid to increase that blood pressure. Then hey, what do ACE inhibitor medications do for our cardiac patients? What do ACE inhibitor medications do for our cardiac patients? If the ACE can't convert angiotensin 1, what occurs? Nice job, nice job. Yes, ACE inhibitors prevent vasoconstriction, and that decreases our blood pressure. Nice job. All right, everybody comes into cardiology with a various anatomy and physiology background. So go ahead and take a few moments, pause this presentation, and write down what you know about resting and action potential. And that has to do with all of those wonderful electrolytes that are on this screen. Sodium, chloride, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. Write it down. Electrolytes play an important role, an important role in cardiac function. Sodium and potassium are the two major players. Sodium is the major role in depolarizing. Calcium helps sodium in depolarization and myocardial contractility. So sodium depolarizing, calcium depolarizing, and contractility. Next is potassium. Major player in repolarization. So then we've got chloride. Current activation may influence membrane potential or permeability. Clyde, the chloride guy, helps things inside and outside of that cell. Then we have mother magnesium. So she's the intracellular modulator. The mother controls the electrical activity in the cell. When mom's not around, bad things happen, just like you know. Bad things in the heart are VTAC or VFib or torsades. So when mom's not around, bad things happen, especially inside the heart. You need mother magnesium. Sodium, depolarization. Calcium, depolarization and contractility. Potassium, repolarization. Chloride, membrane potential. And mom controls the activity in the cell. Remember those. Cardiac depolarization. We start in the resting potential state. Potassium is on the inside of the cell. Sodium is on the outside of the cell. As you can tell from the little minus signs, the inside of the cell is more negatively charged than the outside of the cell. Then in the action potential or depolarization state, sodium rushes inside the cell. And remember, calcium goes with sodium for that depolarization, and calcium also helps with muscle contraction. In the action state, potassium goes out of the cell. When that occurs, the signal hops on down that axon and moves. We've got a resting potential, action potential, resting potential, action potential, resting potential, action potential, as that signal moves on down those cells. Repolarization occurs when sodium and potassium switch back to the resting state. Potassium gets pumped back in by the sodium-potassium pump, and sodium gets pumped out. So let's go through that little part again. We start here, resting potential. We got depolarized, then we repolarize, and then we depolarize, and we repolarize, and we depolarize, and we repolarize. Remember, on that repolarization, the sodium-potassium pump kicks in to move the sodium and potassium back to their correct locations. And that occurs to send those signals on down those nervous cells. Go ahead and launch this link down here, or copy and paste this URL into a new browser window and take a look at the action potential of a nervous impulse. And then come on back to the presentation and we'll continue. Enjoy. After depolarization, we need to repolarize or re-energize ourselves so we can send that signal on down the line. So the cell is only permeable to sodium for a fraction of a second. And after that depolarization, that sodium-potassium pumps that sodium back outside the cell, and it returns to that resting state. Sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. Sort of like those good old water pumps. Pumping water out, but instead of pumping water out, we are pumping sodium outside of our cells. All right, let's review a little bit, and then we'll talk about resting, potential, action, or depolarization, and repolarization. Remember, we've got Mother Magnesium. She's controlling the activity. Mother Magnesium is controlling the activity in the cell. We've got Clyde, the chloride guy, and he's like the doorman. He is like the doorman in the cell, letting sodium in and potassium out. Then, of course, we've got sodium, we've got potassium, and we've got the calcium channel girls that like to go inside when it's time for depolarization and muscle contraction. So remember those players. Mother Magnesium controls the activity in the cell. Clyde, the chloride guy, helps with cellular permeability. We've got sodium, potassium, and the calcium channel girls. And we also have that sodium-potassium pump, or Johnny Bravo, as our bouncer today, to put us back in the repolarized or resting potential state. We start out this phase in the resting potential state. Mother Magnesium's controlling the activity. The potassium's on the inside, the sodium's on the outside, and so is calcium. When it's time for the action to start going, Clyde lets sodium move into the cells. And when sodium moves in, so does calcium. When sodium and calcium move inside a cell, potassium moves outside the cell. And this is action potential or depolarization. And it leapfrogs. We go from here to leapfrog to here. Then, when it's time to repolarize, so the sodium-potassium pump kicks sodium outside the cell, kicks calcium outside the cell, and puts potassium back inside the cell. And we are ready to depolarize again. So we have the resting state, which looks just like our repolarization state. Then we depolarize. Sodium goes out. We depolarize. Sodium goes in and potassium goes out. And the signal moves on down the line. Sodium-potassium pump kicks in to put everybody back in place. Sodium shifted back outside the cell. Potassium's shifted back inside the cell. And we're ready to do it all again. The great thing about cardiac muscle tissue is that it sends electrical charges even faster than the rest of our muscles. These specialized tissues are in our atriums, our ventricles, and the conductive system fibers. So there's a thing called intercalated discs in this cardiac muscle tissue that spreads this electrical impulse 400 times faster than a standard cell membrane. So the signals are lightning fast. And these signals go in a certain pathway called a succinctum. And we'll talk about those here shortly. Another cool aspect of cardiac tissue is every single cell has the potential to start the wave. There are 4 properties of the cardiac conduction system: automaticity, excitability, conductivity, and contractility. Have you ever done the wave in a stadium or at a sporting event? This one little person says, "Hey, I want to start the wave." So they jump up, and the person sitting beside them says, "Oh, that looks fun," and they jump up. The person beside them says, "Hey, that looks fun," and they jump up. The person sits beside them and they say, "Hey, that looks fun," and they jump up. Each person in this stadium has the ability to start the wave, and that ability is automaticity. Each cell has the ability to start the wave. Then their energy or their excitement spreads to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person. Are you getting this? Automaticity, I want to start the wave. Excitability spreads. They conduct their energy to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person. They all contract their muscles and stand up, and they start the wave throughout the stadium. Go ahead and push on the link, and if the link's not working too well, go ahead and copy and paste the URL into another browser window and watch the Guinness Book of World Record wave at a NASCAR racetrack. I want to start the wave. Automaticity, excitability, conductivity, and contractility. Contract those muscles, stand up, and get the wave moving. I mentioned a couple slides ago about a succinctum, and that's a certain way your heart sends these electrical signals. The atrial succinctum goes from the top down. Your ventricle succinctum goes from the bottom up. So inferior to superior for ventricles. So the only way an impulse can be conducted from the atriums to the ventricles is through an AV bundle, or the AV node, or the AV junction, and that's where that signal comes from. We'll talk more about those places in a little bit also. But remember, atrial succinctum goes top down, ventricle succinctum goes bottom up to squeeze that blood. All right, let's get into the conduction system. There's the SA node where the signal starts at the top of your atriums. Signal starts up here in these sinoatrial nodes. They go through the intranodal or intraatrial pathways to the AV node, atrial, ventricular nodes. Then we move through a bundle of His into right and left bundle branches, And then we get down to the bottom of the ventricles and little hair-like fibers called Purkinje fibers. So we got SA node, AV node, bundle of His, right and left bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. The heart does not want to stop beating, so each of these areas has what's called its own inherent rate. If they don't get a signal from above, then they will start beating. There's 3 inherent rates. One in the SA node up top, one in the middle, the AV node, and then an inherent rate of the Purkinje system. And like I said, if the Purkinjes don't get a signal from the AV node, they'll beat on their own. And if the AV node doesn't get a signal from the SA node, the AV node will send the signals to keep the heart beating. Just like the circle of Willis in the brain, the heart likes to keep blood flow to all of its pieces and parts. And remember, that's called anastomosis. So the SA node and the AV nodes are supplied by both the right coronary artery and the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. But most of that blood supply comes from the right coronary artery. So inherent rates. The inherent rate of the SA node is 60 to 100 beats a minute. If the AV node doesn't hear anything from the SA node, they will beat at 40 to 60 times a minute. If their Conduction system doesn't get a signal from above, they will beat 15 to 20, depending on what books you read, 15 or 20 to 40 beats a minute to keep from, or I should say, to prevent cardiac standstill. The Conduction system will beat at 15 or 20 to 40 beats a minute to prevent cardiac standstill. All right, we are once again at everybody's favorite slide. In summary, remember all the important electrical conductions of the signals moving through the heart from top to bottom. The alpha receptors, the beta receptors, those chronotropic, inotropic, dromotropic properties that are so important in sending these signals on down the line. The special parts of those intercalated discs that send those signals 400 times faster than normal cells to keep that single signal moving. Those succinctums, atrial succinctum from top down, ventricle succinctum from bottom up, the resting potential with potassium on the inside and sodium on the outside, the action potential where sodium and calcium rush in to depolarize that cell while potassium rushes out. And then that big, strong sodium potassium pump pumps the sodium out and pumps the potassium back in to reset for the next electrical discharge to send those signals on down the line. Remember, every part of the cardiac conduction system can start the wave, and that's called automaticity. I want to start the wave. They get excited and conduct that excitement to each other's cells, and those cells contract, and that signal gets sent down the line. I hope you enjoyed cardiac physiology, and stay tuned for the next presentation.